Welcome back to Web 110, HTML and CSS. So in this video, I'm going to start talking about content that is from Chapter 8. And just a bit of a warning, Chapter 8 is the longest as far as the amount of content that is covered. And it is also the hardest for just kind of introducing new concepts, just being very complex in how those concepts are introduced. And the reason for that is because a lot of it has to do with working with complex layouts and how to arrange things. And so I'd really recommend that you go through very carefully for the reading and do all of the examples as you're going through and doing the reading to just help familiarize yourself with the content so you have kind of a better idea of how to do everything. I actually wrote the homework assignment so that way you would be working with Flexbox, and that's because I find that Flexbox is a little bit easier than the grid layout versus the homework assignments in the book. They cover grid layout, but it is important that you are familiar with both of those so that way you have kind of a better idea in the future. There will be an assignment in the future where you will use a grid and you're going to use it when you're working with a form. So you do want to get familiar with it. So I'm going to have a video that's going to cover the Flexbox, and then the next video is going to cover grid layouts. And then the third video is going to cover working with media queries, which is going to be looking at how you can work with sets of styles. So styles for desktop, styles for tablet, and styles for mobile. So it ends up being a lot of content all in one chapter. The nice thing is once you get a handle of all of this and you figure out how to do the homework assignment, things should get a little bit easier from here, and the content in the chapter should get shorter, and it should be easier to go through everything. So this chapter will probably take more time to go through everything, but then after that we'll go over working with tables, working with forms, and it'll be kind of back to working with more isolated content on the pages. So for these two videos, I'm going to use some examples from the book, and they have this really nice example that works with these pictures of birds. And so what I want for you to do is, and if you've downloaded all of the files for the textbook, you would be able to find these in the textbook anyways, but I've got the actual birds inside of a folder, and you can find this under the file section. So if you go to files, you'll find in here the bird folder, and you can just go ahead and download that whole thing. And that's going to be what we're going to use for both the Flexbox example, and then we're also going to use it for the grid example as well. All right, so I've gone ahead and I've downloaded this folder, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it inside of week 5, and then when we are actually creating our HTML files, I'm going to put them inside of the bird folder, and that's just going to make it easier to keep everything simple for the links, so that way we don't have to say I want to go into the bird folder in order to link to it. So that's going to be our plan. Now, as far as the resources for this week goes, I didn't talk about any of these before because most of these actually apply to Chapter 8. So there's going to be a link here. I've got CSS Flexbox, and then there is a Froggy game. There's Flexbox Adventure. For some reason, those aren't published, so I'll try to make sure that those are viewable when you're going through. And then I found this really nice link that talks about the right way to structure HTML pages, which I think has some good general advice. There's the 960 grid system, which I think we looked at in a previous video. If not, it just shows how you can kind of break up a website based off a grid, which will help when we take a look at the grids. And then I've got CSS grid layout module, making and breaking the grid. So just some books and resources that can be helpful for learning how to start thinking and designing based off of grids. And then a link to the meta tag, and then information about media queries. So I'll tell you which ones are going to be relevant for which topic. And I'm going to wait a little bit on these links until I've actually covered what everything is. All right, so there is enough new content that I think it's going to be best to actually type up some notes while I talk to you, so you have some stuff on the screen to help follow along. All of this stuff is going to still be in the book as well, but just in case that helps make it a little bit easier. So what we're going to be looking at, because we did look a little bit at float and clear, and that helps you organize things a little bit more locally. But one of the nice things about working with Flexbox and grid layout is you can work with more of a complex multi-column website. And there's going to be a little bit of differences. What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce Flexbox and grid kind of more as an overall at the same time right now. Because then we can kind of compare, like, why would you want to use one versus the other, and what exactly is different about them. So this would actually be called CSS Flexible Box Layout, and then CSS Grid Layout. A lot of times this just gets shortened to Flexbox, and then we have our grid layout. So for our CSS Flexible Box Layout, it helps to provide a flexible layout within a flexible container. And I don't know that I've really talked about this. I might have said something very briefly, but it's probably, if I did, I'm not going to assume that you would be able to remember it, but these focus a lot on having a container and then having items inside of it. So I'm just going to write that, container with items inside. And this comes to this idea of having a parent-child relationship. And this is something that gets talked a lot about in code, but it also is something that's relevant even if you're doing like video editing, because you are basically having a container, that would be the parent, and then you have the items inside of that, which are called the children, and they inherit different properties from that parent container. And it's the same thing, like with video editing, you could be editing a single object, and then you could have other things that would parent to that item. So if you were to animate it in some way, everything else would animate and follow and inherit different values from it. So you see it in a lot of different things. And it basically just means these things are going to inherit something from whatever parent container. So we can just write that. So you could say inherit values, or you could think of it like inheriting certain behaviors or something from that. But it's just meaning that they're connected to each other, and you can kind of control the items that are inside of it by changing something about the container. And that's going to be really important for Flexbox and grid layout, is just to know that a lot of what you're going to apply is going to be applied to the container, not necessarily the items individually inside of the container. It'll be a bit of a mix of both. So one of the things that makes Flexbox different is it's configured in one dimension. You can either pick horizontal or vertical. Now, with the grid layout, it's going to be the same thing. It's also going to be container with items inside of it. It's also going to have the parent and child relationship where you can inherit different values. But this one allows for you to configure in 2 dimensions. So it gives you more complex layout. So if you're wanting to create a design where you're focusing on the whole website, and I'll just put this as a note, great for whole website layouts. So where you could have, let's say you have the header at the very top of your page, you've got a navigation on the left, you've got your main on the right, you've got your footer going all the way across. You could use that to kind of lay out where every single piece is going to be. Versus if you're working with a Flexbox, this is going to be better for smaller, more local groupings, because you can only go in one direction. Now for your homework assignment, you're going to have two flex boxes. You're going to use this for your navigation. And in the past, we had it so that way the navigation was controlled by having the items have display of inline. Once they got to be in the unordered list, they're all inline, so they can all be next to each other. And it's going to kind of limit what you can do with the links as you resize the window. Versus Flexbox, by having all of those links as a Flexbox, we're going to be able to control a little bit better what happens to those items in that container, that grouping of the nav. We can kind of control how things would kind of change as you resize it for mobile. So everything is going to be kind of preparing everything to be a little bit more mobile friendly. So that's why we would want to use a Flexbox there. And then the next spot where we're going to have a Flexbox is with those sections that got created with the last assignment, where you have the main and you've got these 4 sections that are creating these columns. And the float works fine, but by being able to use the Flexbox and in that case, what you would have is the main is going to be, actually, it depends. So you could either, if you have other content in the main might not be the container. You might have a section that goes around each of those individual columns, or you could have the main sort of behave as a container. So it's going to depend on your setup. And the reason I want to say that is because when it comes to working with your final and where you need to have your website be 2 columns, you could have main be what is the parent container, or you could kind of create subsections and then have divs. And we're gonna create an example that is going to help you with that, so you can reference it later. It's going to help though with more local relationships, and in the case of the homework, you're going to have those columns of the individual paragraphs. Those are going to be your items, and then they're going to be in a parent container, and they're going to inherit some styles from it. So you're going to use Flexbox in 2 different places. And then eventually you are going to have a grid layout, and that's going to be done with your form. And the reason for having that in a form is it's just going to help you control a little bit better how you organize all of the labels for your form, and then all of the different places where you can actually add in values, like somebody's name or email address or whatever the case might be for the form. So we're going to have a couple of cases where we can use it, but Flexbox is better for smaller, more local groupings. Now, if you had a really simple website, like one that is just everything stacked over top of each other, you technically could organize everything as a Flexbox. But there wouldn't really be a need for it, because you can just use display and have everything block display. And that's something that you're going to notice too when you start working with having these sets of styles for desktop, tablet, and mobile, is you might have a Flexbox that is created for the desktop version and maybe for the tablet too. And then for mobile, rather than having it still be a Flexbox, a lot of times the directions will just say, just have the mobile styles have display block. Or it might not even say anything at all, because the default in your browser is to have display block. So by just removing it and not having anything, it's going to inherit that style, and so everything will just stack over top of each other. And so that's going to be how everything can change. Is in the desktop, it's going to be in a Flexbox where everything can kind of sit next to each other, and then when it is mobile, everything will just stack on top of each other as a block. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself there. I'll come back to that thought when I go through the video for media queries. But I just wanted to give you a bit of an idea of kind of everything overall together. So part of why Chapter 8 is so large is because this content is new to, not necessarily new to this edition, it's new to the 5th edition. And this is one of those cases where I've had students ask, is it okay for me to use an older edition of the book? The 4th edition doesn't have any of this content in it. It has media queries, but it doesn't have Flexbox and grid layout. And the 5th edition does have this content, but it has less fleshed out examples. And so the examples are a lot better in the 6th edition for teaching these concepts, and I think that's very important. So I would definitely recommend that you have the right edition of the book for this chapter so you can understand everything. But what that really means is Flexbox and grid layout, they've been around for a while, but they are newer to HTML5, and it was taking a while before they actually reached full W3C candidate recommendation status, and before they became well supported enough in popular browsers to become recommended. So the textbook didn't adopt teaching this content until it became supported enough that it was worth having. So that's kind of a bit of a warning, because what that means is it's newer, and so some older browsers might not support these, and that's where it's really helpful to have the W3C website, because it can go and it can tell you which browsers is this going to be supported in, what sort of backup styles would you need to have in order to have it show correctly. But that's one of the reasons why our books are constantly changing, is because all of this stuff it's changing in real time. And a couple of years from now, there's probably going to be other things that start changing that need to get added. So it's really good for you to keep an eye out on the W3C website and just become familiar with looking to see what sort of things are changing. So anyways, both Flexbox and grid layout have recently reached W3C candidate recommendation status. So that's the same for both of them. All right, so what we're going to do is I'm going to kind of keep this around so that way I can write out the names, but all the names of the different properties that are going to be covered, they're going to be in your textbook as well. All right, so I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code, create a new file, and then when I go to save this, I'm going to save this into the bird folder, and we'll call this one Flex, and then ultimately we'll create one that's called Grid, and we'll add that in there as well. Oh, you know what? I forgot to specify what kind of file. Okay, and then, you know, our typical starting I'm going to call this Flexbox layout. And I'm going to put the styles inside of here so it's easier for us to keep track of everything and see everything. All right, so let me double check the page number on this. All right, so I've got the old edition page number in my notes, but if you are interested in looking at this in your book, in case that ends up being a little bit easier than trying to see things on my screen, on page 266, this is the example that we're looking at, and you'll notice that there's going to be a div with an ID called gallery. We'll end up adding styles to that ID called gallery, and then it's just going to be bringing up these 6 images. So you'll have 6 images, they're all going to have the same width and height, and then there's going to be some alt text for them. And then we're going to slowly add in different properties to change the values of these. And the nice thing about this is you can see illustrations of what this looks like in the book too. So if you've got that around, that might be kind of helpful for you to reference. All right, I'm going to start with the div, and it has the ID is going to be called gallery because this is going to be a gallery of the 6 different pictures of birds. And then we're going to add in the name bird, width, it's going to be 200 pixels. And then once you have one, probably the easiest thing to do would be to copy it. And then just swap out the numbers and the names. All right, so that's going to be everything for the HTML section. And then with our style, we're going to add in our ID. Now, so the div in this case is the parent, and all of these images are the items inside of the container. And so they're going to be the children. So they're going to inherit the styles. So most of the styles that you're going to see in this beginning section, they're all going to be applied to the container itself. And then these children are going to inherit the styles of the parent. So for starters, if you want something to behave as either a flexible container or as a grid, then you need to change the display to either flex or grid. So that's going to be one of the first things, is the parent container needs to have display of flex or display of grid. And that's something that's not always going to be said in the directions. So when you're doing the homework and it says you need to turn this into a flexible container, what that's really saying is this thing needs to have display set to flex. Or if it's talking about turning it into a grid, it's going to assume that you're going to know, I need to change this so that way it has a display of grid. And then all of these things inside of it are going to end up being controlled and inheriting things from it. So that's going to be one of the first things. And then as we go through, I'm going to just kind of update our notes with some different properties. And before I go into these properties, let's save this and actually take a peek at what it looks like by now, just by default. All right, so by default, we just have all of these birds are just kind of in line with each other. Now, what would be a little bit more telling is, let me actually remove this display right now, because I don't want it to inherit any of the default items. Okay, so by default, when we have pictures, they are going to have a display of inline. And as the window resizes, they'll go on to the next line. And you'll see that there's this little bit of margin space that's getting added around between each of them and the sides of them. So you technically could have a gallery where you have everything as just display inline like this, and you could kind of have it work the way you want. What's really handy about working with Flexbox is you just have so many more options for how you can actually add different styles to how everything is working as a group and then also working individually. So it's the power of working with it as a flexible container that really helps out a lot, because we're going to be able to control the spacing between these different items, how they, like the order they're showing, if they're showing in a row or in a column, how they're kind of wrapping around. And you'll kind of get a better idea of that as we go along. But I wanted you to know that there is going to be a little bit of a visual similarity to just having things be inline, because you could technically do kind of the same thing here with just having inline. Same thing with your homework. When you have the navigation that gets changed to a Flexbox, you might wonder, why even bother having it in a Flexbox? Why not just have everything as being inline? And part of it's going to be the benefits of having some of these styles that can kind of change how everything is filling in the space. All right, so I'm going to put that back. So we have display flex. So you'll notice we've got kind of by default, all of these things are in a row with each other. That's going to be one of our things. And then by default, it's not wrapping anymore. It's just creating this horizontal scroll. So that's going to be one of our first properties, is going to be that we can add a flex wrap. So the options here are just that you can have wrap or no wrap with a hyphen. And you would apply this to your container. So I'd say flex wrap, and then since right now it has the default of no wrap, so let's just do wrap. I'll save that. And so now they're wrapping to fill in the container. So right now this is behaving very similar to having everything be inline. The next property that I wanted to go over is, I'll just write this. At a certain point, it's not going to really matter to write these all down because they're pretty straightforward, and you'll see them in the code. But kind of just in case, I want to have those notes there for you. So I mentioned before that you can have things either be horizontal or vertical, and so this is where you get to choose the direction. So you can say, I want it to be a row, or you can say that you want it to be a column. And this is one of the ways in which you can very easily change things to be kind of mobile friendly or desktop friendly, because you could have a flex container. And let's just write one of these. So right now we can do flex direction, and let's say row. And that should be the default anyways. So what we would be saying is, like, imagine this is your navigation and you have all of your links going across horizontally. So you can say, when my website is the size of a desktop, I want this flexible box to have everything be in a row. And then even as you resize it, if there's not enough room, those links will just kind of stack in over top of each other. And that's exactly what's going to happen. But then you could say, okay, well, when it's mobile, I want it to be a column, and then everything is going to stack over top of each other, similar to a display block. And so those would all stack over top of each other. So it's a nice way to be able to switch. So you can kind of go back and forth between which one you want to choose. I'm just going to keep that to row. And there is another property that actually combines these together as kind of a bit of a shorthand. You can think of it a bit like when you're working with, let's say, border, and you can specify the border size, color, and style all together. So if you're only wanting to really specify one of these, like wrap or direction, you can do them separately, or you can do flex flow. But it's basically going to be these combined. So then you can say, for example, I want it to be a row and I want it to wrap. And you just put the values with a space between them. The next one that I'm going to go over, this one starts talking about the spacing. So up until now, we've been working with padding and margins to control the spacing. But if you can think about it, when you're working with a website that is really responsive, it could potentially be really difficult to try to determine just how much padding and spacing is really going to be appropriate to fit every single possible way that something might display. So what's nice about the Justify content is it gives you a lot of different options for how things are going to arrange themselves. And this is where the book might be helpful for illustrating. And actually, these illustrations help a lot too, because what's happening is depending on if your container is a row or a column, will kind of change how this works. So the justify content property configures how the browser should display extra space, so that white space, along the main axis in the Flex container. So if you are working with your content in a row going across, then the main axis is horizontal. So it's going to be how much space is to the left and right in between your items. Versus if you're working with your content in a column, then your main axis that you're going is going to be vertical, and it will say how much space should be at the top, the bottom, and then between the top and bottom of all of the items in between it. And the left, like if it's horizontal, the left is going to be your starting place, and then your right is going to be the end place. But it also depends on the order you go in. That's something that I forgot to mention. So for Flex Direction, you also have the option of going the opposite way. So for Flex Direction, you can do row, column, reverse row, and reverse column. So if you were to do reverse row, for example, then your starting place would actually be on the right side, and then your end would be on the left. So it's just going to depend on which direction you're going and where you're starting and where you're ending. And then for the justify content property, you have Flex Start. So that's the default. So all of your items are going to start on the main start. So for this picture, it would be here on the left, or here at the top would be your start. Flex End items are going to begin at the end. Center is just going to center everything and put extra empty space on both sides. Space between is going to kind of evenly divide everything. And then space around is going to add space between everything, but then a little bit of space on the sides. So this is a really good picture that shows this. So we've got Flex Start is on the left, Flex End is on the right. Centering is going to put everything centered. Space between adds kind of even white space. So this is where it helps a lot, rather than you having to figure out the padding or putting in like a percentage or something. You could just say, well, I want the content to have space around, and it'll kind of figure out for you what would be kind of the appropriate spacing to keep everything sort of evenly arranged. So I'm going to do justify content, space around, save that. You can kind of think of this a little bit kind of like text alignment, if that kind of helps. So you have Flex Start, Flex End, Center, space between, and space around. Now there's another style that is called Align Items property, and it configures the way the browser displays extra space along the cross axis. This one will also have Flex Start, Flex End, Center. In this case, it'll have baseline, and then it will have stretch. So this one is harder to illustrate with the picture of the birds, just because all of them are the same size, and so you can't really see a whole lot with it. But that's why I wanted to have some links here to the W3 Schools website, where they're going to have a lot here for just kind of general Flexbox. And if you look on the left, you'll see other ones that are similar. Now, I think the one I'm looking for is under the container. We've got Flex Direction, Flex Wrap, Flex Flow, Justify, And then here we have one with align items, which these are all the same size, so we're not going to see as much here. Here's one that I think is going to help the most. So here we have an example of baseline. And so since all of these are different sizes, what it's doing is it's saying the baseline of the content. So in this case, there's this text inside of it. So it's making it so the baseline of all of this text lines up with each other, even though the size of the individual items is different. So it's aligning it by that. Versus we also have stretch. And so it's stretching the containers to fill the whole height of the, or it's stretching the items so they fill the container that it's in. And then if we had like flex end, they're all going to align up with the bottom of the container. Here they're aligning with the top of the container. So this would help a lot better if we had a container that was a fixed size and it had a very distinctive color to it. And then I think this is one that your book doesn't talk about, but it's the align content property, and it's used to align the flex lines. And you'll see that it's looking more at the content as everything is grouped into these kind of subgroupings. So we've got these lines of items and we have space around, so it's adding space between them, and then it's also adding some space above and below these individual ones. But that's something that doesn't get talked about in your book. All right, so that is going to be the align content property. All right, so the next properties that we're going to look at, they're actually going to have to do more with the items now. So everything that we had been looking at is more about the container. And that's where I think the W3C, or I should say W3 Schools example, I think is so helpful because it gives a list of flex direction, flex wrap, flex flow, justify content, align items, align content. And then on their CSS Flex items page, here they go through all of these other ones. And these are ones that I think your book doesn't go into as much detail on. So I think, well, I'll just kind of scroll through what we have here. So there is the order property, and it specifies the order of your Flex items. What's really great about this is you could have something show in a certain order when it's on desktop, and you can actually change the order of the items when it's on, let's say, mobile or something. And so what's a little confusing about this is the way they've set up the example, and this is why I like to caution about looking online for resources instead of looking at your book. I would always recommend that you look at your book first. W3 Schools is great, but you'll notice they use a lot of inline styles, and then also they use divs for everything. So like here they have each of these is a little div, and then they put it inside of a div, and that can end up making it kind of confusing if you aren't really sure what you're looking at. But the key gist of this is they're using the order property and they're applying it to this first div, and it has the number 1 inside of it, and they're saying I want this to be in the 3rd position, and so the actual box that has 1 on it is the 3rd box. And they have the next one, which is being applied to the one with the number 2 on it. They're saying they want that in the 2nd position. The one with the number 3 on it, they're saying they want that to be in the 4th position. And then the one with the number 4 on it, they want it to be in the 1st position. So even though this looks a little weird because we haven't really practiced a lot of inline styles, what that's essentially saying is that is being applied. So what you could do instead of having this is you could just have an ID that's called 1, an ID called 2, an ID called 3. Next, there is the flex grow property, and it specifies how much a flex item will grow relative to the rest of the flex items. So by default, it's 0, so it wouldn't be growing at all. So what you could say here, and again, they have some inline styles, they're saying, I want each of these to just increase by 1. And so this last one is going to grow at 8 times the rate of these other ones. And you could go and click on it and kind of resize it and see how that behaves. So that might be the case. Like, let's say that you do have a navigation. Let's say that you're using this like to have your navigation and your main next to each other. You could say, you know, I don't want the nav to get any larger. I just want the main to be able to get larger as it resizes. Maybe that would be a reason why you might want to do this. But it lets you control each item individually. And then on the opposite end, you have the flex shrink property, and it's going to specify how much something is going to shrink after it loads up with the initial size. Flex bases property specifies the initial length of a flex item. So you could say, you know, I want this to initially start as 200 pixels, and then everything else might be more like a percentage ratio, for example. And then the flex property is a shorthand, again, for flex grow, flex shrink, and flex bases. So you can list all of those next to each other. The align self property specifies the alignment for the selected item inside of the flexible container. So you could kind of determine if you want just one individual thing to change its alignment. So it looks like this one, it has this being centered, and then all the other ones are kind of taking up the whole distance of the space. Maybe they've got stretch or something, for example. And then here you can see a little bit more information about them. So that's all you really need to know about for those. Again, your textbook I don't think really covers the items in as much detail. It's really focusing more on the container itself. What they do next with this example, though, is they basically turn it into a nice little gallery. And what I like about this example is it really shows you something that you might actually use. And I've often had students tell me, oh, I wish I knew how to do this before the midterm when you're working on the portfolio, because you could actually add it to your portfolio. And I think it's fine either way. But basically, they just go in and they add in the image with a 1em margin, and then they add a box shadow to it. So if you wanted to, we could do that real quick. And they might have added a few other things. I think otherwise it should be about the same as the example in the book. So I don't think you really have to worry about missing out much there. Now, here's something that I do like in the book where it is looking at flexible items. They have this example where they're showing how, okay, well, maybe since you might want to have a multi-column layout, and this is something you could think about for the final. You could say, I want the header to not be part of this flexible container, and I don't want the footer because they're just going to go on the top. But maybe you want to have a navigation on the left, a main in the center, and then you could have an aside, some sort of like sidebar or something. And they're using this to show how you can actually use the flex property to basically create ratios. So you're saying, I want the navigation to have a ratio of 1. And so that means that the flex 7 is going to be 7 times as big as that. The aside is going to be twice as big as that. It doesn't quite look like that in the picture, but that kind of just helps to illustrate that. And then it talks a little bit about what you can do with the order property, how you could use that to potentially help with accessibility. And then they give you a little bit of practice with it. So that's going to be basically where we're going to end working with the Flexbox and what the book has. Now I want to show you these links that I have on here. So this first one, that was a link to the W3 schools. And then this is a website I found out about from a coworker, and it's just called Flexbox Froggy Game. or I guess Flexbox Froggy, and it lets you practice with these different properties. And so it gives you this little example. Okay, so if you're working with justified content, then how might you get this frog over to the lily pad? And it's nice, it gives you all these definitions. So if we look at like flex end, that's going to align things to the right. So then we can check our work and it'll move us on to the next one. So here we want to center them. And if you want to, you can always jump to the end and you can start looking at the complexity of it. So at some point you might have to use all these other ones, like it's showing, okay, so far we've learned justify content, align items, flex direction, order, align self, flex wrap, flex flow, and align content. So I would recommend, if you do go through this, to go through them in order, because it will slowly make it more complicated. Now, when I've showed that before in class, I had a student who told me about this website, and this one is really cool. It's actually changed over time, because when I first heard about it, they were still in the process of building out the grid version, and then now they've got this Elon regex as well. It looks like it's still being worked on, so eventually at some point that will work, but there's going to be a practice for working with the grid, and then there's this practice with the Flexbox. And this is done like a little RPG where you can choose if you want to do easy, medium, or hard. You can't choose the levels because they're locked. They make you go through the order, but you'll notice there's 24, so it's the same number. And then they give you a little bit more information. So, for example, you can kind of keep track of your stats. So here we have health, and so right now our health, it looks like it's 50 out of 100. I'm assuming by eating the apple, that's going to give us health. And they go into more detail. I think they actually describe things in more detail here than the frog one, but they actually add more complexity. Here they're illustrating it. Okay, they're telling us that we have this flex end, and then they're showing us what does space between look like, what does space around look like. And so then we can do the same thing. We can do justify, center, and then that puts this over the apple. We get confetti. Now we've added 10 health to our hero. And then kind of a similar thing. Okay, now we can practice again. We've got a carrot. Carrot also gives us plus 10. And then now we have 2 characters. I have no idea what this is. It looks very, whatever it is. I know we've got the first one is cheese, and then whatever this second image is supposed to be. We want to be able to move this character over here. So we have our different options again, and we've got some context here where it looks like we've got Arthur and Marilyn, and they're going to work together, and they need to restore their health. And so then we think about what would do that. So if we do space between, now we've added health to both of them. And it's just going to slowly go through more and more examples of this. So that's another fun thing that you can try out. I'm going to go ahead and show you this next one just because I think it's something that you could really use pretty easily with Flexbox to work on for your homework. I've got a lot of students who've asked me questions about how to really start with a more complex website page, because what we look at in class is usually pretty simple. And I liked this article because it was talking about basically how you can take a design like this, and it really recommends basically just take your website and break it down into these horizontal sections. So we've got this first section that has an image, and then we've got this white one with some text on it. We've got the third one that has an image on the right and then text on the left, and then we've got this fourth one. And so each of these you would put into a section, and then inside of that section you would break things down into more complex blocks. So like this third one, this would be a section element, and you would have two divs. You would have a div on the right, a div on the left, and then inside of that div you might have an additional div. You could kind of build up more of this detail, but it would start there. And here it even goes in and describes it. The page has 4 main horizontal sections. The first section has a header with a logo and nav buttons. The section also has a background image. And then it says the second one has a solid background color and text. Third one, and it goes in to describe each of these. And it says the TLF approach works in the following manner. First, divide the design horizontally, then divide the horizontal parts vertically. And here they've basically taken the design, and this could be something like maybe you're getting a mock-up from a graphic designer that you're working with, or a UX designer, and they're giving you this static, and it's up to you to figure out how to actually kind of put everything together. So you've got this wireframe, and it breaks this down. So the outermost parent is the one with the blue border. It can be divided horizontally, etc. And then what I really liked about this is it puts all of this inside of divs. And that's something that is kind of an outdated practice, where before you really had HTML5, everything was really done with a div, and you would just give it an ID or a class, and you would say, this is a class called, in this case we've got div class banner container, div class header, div class logo, div class navigation. Only now we can actually turn it into an actual navigation and just put the links inside of it. So I think this kind of helps to illustrate what maybe some examples might look like that you're finding, and then it also shows a lot of commenting to kind of help explain it. And then what I like about it though is it says, okay, well now we want to use proper semantic HTML tags. We want to avoid using depreciated HTML tags. We want to make sure everything validates. And so they write it in a better, more concise way, where they say, okay, well, we still are going to put this in a div, kind of like we have with the wrapper, but we're going to create a header. And then if we have to, we'll put, now in this case, I don't know that this image needs to be in a div, but they've gone ahead and done that. But then they went and they replaced all of the divs for the nav, and they just put it in a UL. And then they have a button here. Again, I don't know that it needs to be in a div, but that's what they've done. And then all of that is inside the header. And then they have all of that inside of that div for the banner. So I think it's just a nice way of breaking things down. And then also kind of showing how you could take kind of a outdated way of organizing things and then put it into a better structure. I'm going to leave this video here, and I think what I'm going to do is in the media queries, I'm going to show you how you could actually design a website that might help you with your final project, where you could use Flexbox as an example, because then you can actually see it in more practice. But if you do have any questions over working with Flexbox, don't hesitate to leave a comment in the discussion or to send me an email.